Welcome back to the What Do We Do podcast. To tip or not to tip? That is the question. What was once a gesture of appreciation has now become more complicated than ever. On today's podcast, we're discussing tipping, the etiquette, the expectations, and when you can politely, or maybe not so politely, decline to tip. It's going to be a great show, so hit the subscribe button, give us a follow, and let's go. Welcome back to another episode of the What Do We Do podcast. I'm your host, Dewey Steffen, and this is an episode on tipping. In a world where your waitstaff and your auto mechanic are not just wanting but expecting a tip, and in a world where there's electronic payments, kiosks that spin around, and an automatic 20% added to it seems like everything, we're going to break down when you should tip, when maybe you should skip the tip, and what are maybe the consistently average or expected tips out there today. All right, well, in today's episode, I don't think it surprises anyone that tipping has gone way beyond what it used to be years ago. And I think we can also all agree that the genesis of this, what can be considered excessive tipping, would be because of COVID. And through COVID, many of us gladly tipped above and beyond what would be a normal gratuity because of the services we were being provided. But here we are in 2024, and it seems like whatever you do, someone has their hand out looking for a tip, expecting a tip. From the traditional full-service sit-down meal, which has always been an expectation to tip in America, to now, wherever you go, whatever you do, there seems to be a tip line on the bill that you are given. So, what are these blurred lines? What do we do to figure out where in today's society it is appropriate to tip, it is extra, but a great idea to tip, or maybe what are the scenarios where tipping isn't necessary, but we're feeling guilted into it, or we're encouraged to do it just because it's on there and we have to hit decline to refuse to tip. This is where everyone is trying to understand not only where they are personally comfortable tipping or not tipping, but also society as a whole. For today's episode, I'm going to be providing a lot of data from a lot of different sources because I believe that we all may have a bias. We all may have our own bias of what's an acceptable tip, where's an acceptable situation to tip, and maybe what we believe is appropriate, society doesn't feel the same. So, one of the sources I'm going to go to today is Forbes Advisor. And in 2023, Forbes Advisor had a survey that asked people, how do they feel about tipping? Well, 31% of respondents said they feel pressured to tip. 26% feel overwhelmed to tip. 23% embarrassed to tip. 23% also guilty to tip. 20% confused on the tip. And 18% uncomfortable with tipping. And the number one service most likely to receive a tip would be that of a sit-down restaurant experience, with 58% of the respondents saying they would tip. Why that's not close to 100, I have no idea. But second on the list was food delivery drivers at 46%. Fast casual restaurants, 42%, salons and spas, 40%, bars, 39%, food trucks, 36%, coffee shops, 35%, taxi rideshare drivers, 32%, picking up takeout food, 31% of respondents said they are most likely to tip on picking up takeout food. I find that very interesting. Hotel services, 24%, childcare, 20%, and even movers at 17%. Well, according to Forbes Advisor in their 2023 survey, the largest number of respondents believe they should not have to tip food trucks. That came in at 40%. Fast casual restaurants, 38%. Picking up takeout food, those same people, 36%. Coffee shops, 34%. Food delivery drivers, 32%. Bars, 30%. Salon and spas, 28%. Childcare, 28%. Hotel services, 22%. And those same movers, 18%. All right, so now that you have an idea of what is most likely a fair place to tip and what are some places that some surveyed respondents don't really think it's appropriate to tip, I'm going to give you a list now from Kiplinger's that talks about what you should tip if you are going to tip. All right, well, first on our list is pretty doggone easy, and that would be sit-down, full-service restaurants. In America, I think by now most of the listeners and viewers of this podcast would agree that tipping is between 15 and 25% of your bill. I think the standard is 15 if you receive average service, and maybe 20%, perhaps 25% if you receive exceptional service. However, do you tip pre-tax? Do you tip post-tax? Where do you fall if you have a bunch of wine, alcohol, other non-food items? Perhaps you have a gift certificate that you purchase on your bill. What part of the bill do you tip on? Is it the whole bottom line balance? Or, as I do, I tip between 20 and 25% of the bill pre-tax. All right, and as a public service announcement, I do want to disclose that I grew up bussing tables, waiting tables, bartending my way through college. I also was a caddy at a country club working for tips. I shined shoes. I've done many, many things in my prior life that the majority of my income was from tips. So I do believe that I'm uber aware of the service industry and those around me that are working for tips. So when I disclose what I tip, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to follow suit, but I do think this is an amazing conversation to have because there are several categories that even surprise me. After we discuss sit-down restaurants and the 15 to 25%, let's talk about delivery drivers and what to tip them. According to the research, restaurant delivery, 15 to 20% of your total order. Grocery delivery, 15 to 20% of your total order. Alcohol delivery, 15 to 20% more for heavier carrying crates. And flour delivery, how about between $2 and $5? Now, when it comes to hotels, there are many people there that are servicing the guests, and where and when should you tip them? How about the hotel porter toting your bags? The recommendation is $2 to $3 per bag at a basic hotel or motel, or $5 per bag at one of those posh hotels. One that always gets me is room service. I don't typically get room service because typically not only is there the food charge, but there's a service charge and then a tip charge on top of that. So I figure I'll just walk on down to wherever they cook and serve the food and I'll order it from there and save myself a service charge. But I do understand if people want to eat in their room and they just want to pay the extra charges to be served and served well. Well, in this scenario, you should add on a 10% additional tip to the gratuity that's already added or the service charge already on the bill. And if there is not a gratuity on your room service, then it's a minimum 20% that you should add to the bill. How about toiletry or towel delivery? I have many times asked for additional towels or some of the toiletry items to be brought up from housekeeping or the front desk. And I absolutely always give whoever delivers me those goods a few dollars as a tip. But according to the survey, a $3 to $5 delivery for toiletry or towels at a basic hotel would be standard, and $5 to $10 at a fancy hotel. Hopefully, you're not just receiving these items and not tipping. If so, now you know. How about the doorman? If he hails you a cab, $5 to $10 is the suggested tip. Unless it's raining, then more. Most posh or fancy hotels have a concierge, and most of us go and ask the concierge where we should eat, where can we get tickets to the show, where are the museums, how do you find the subway? They're giving you directions left, they're giving you directions right. They might be even making the restaurant reservations for you. So it absolutely is customary to tip the concierge, but how much? Well, according to the survey, $5 or more, depending on the difficulty of the request. So when you are out at a posh hotel or you are out enjoying all of the wonderful amenities that are out there, make sure that you are including the tip so that the people that are servicing you feel the love. Last but not least with hotels, this is my favorite, and this is the housekeeping tip. I have kids that I travel with. When I travel with friends, we always seem to agree or disagree on if we should and how much we should tip the housekeeper. For me, I look at it as a daily housekeeping charge, and so I usually leave between a $5 and a $10 bill, either on the nightstand or on the edge of the bed, so that they know that it's not just left there on accident, wadded up on a ball on the desk, but I usually leave, again, between $5 and $10 a day. And according to the survey, the suggested tipping guideline is $3 to $5 per day for 1 to 3 people in the room, or $10 per day if 6 people in a room. Well, who the heck's going to have 6 people in the room? I'd like to talk to those people about this survey. Okay, for those that go to the salon or spa, how much do you tip? Well, according to the survey, manicurists should receive 20% per nail technician. Hairstylists and barbers, 20% for the entire service. Massages and facials, 15 to 20% of the entire service. The next category of tipping will be transportation. I always find this very interesting when talking to my friends because we have taxis, we have Ubers and other ride share services. You also have shuttles and whatever else you'll use as transportation. According to the survey, limousine drivers should receive 10 to 20% of the entire fare. And taxi drivers should receive between 15 and 20% of the entire fare. And rideshare services should receive 10 to 20% of the entire fare, even if the apps for ride-hailing services do not give you an option for gratuity. You're supposed to leave one anyway. I find this very interesting because when you use Lyft or Uber, there is not an automatic tip feature. There is one after the ride is over, and my friends and I agree to disagree. Some of us say that no additional tip is necessary on top of the ride. the rest of us think that no, a little extra gratuity should be added because it is for your taxi fares. So why not for your Uber, Lyft, or other ride shares also? This last one in transportation is one that I also make sure I always do, and that is the shuttle drivers. Whenever I am on a shuttle from point A to point B, the airport to the hotel, or from the event back to where I started, always leave $2 to $3 as a tip for your shuttle driver. That's according to the survey. All right, well, real fast, I'm going to leave a couple anecdotes for you on recent travel adventures that I've had. On one adventure to Beverly Hills, California, I went to a restaurant for brunch. And when the bill came, there was definitely a line for me to add gratuity. But then there was an asterisk below that and a message that said an additional 5% had automatically been added for the healthcare benefits of the employees. I had never heard of this before, so I had to take a pause, even take a picture with my phone so that I could think about this later. So, what do you think? Besides just a tip, should you also be adding in to the healthcare benefits of a wait staff at a restaurant? Another anecdote I'm going to share is when I went to Las Vegas. I went to Wahlburgers to have a meal, and this is much more common, but there was a note underneath the gratuity line that said 3.99% of the bill had been added if I was going to use a credit card. So again, this is not really on the topic of tipping, but it does resonate too. In addition to the cost of the services, now if you use a credit card, you may have to pay the credit card service charge. If you pay cash, some places say they won't accept cash. They only use credit cards. So you're kind of in a quandary. In this scenario, I used my credit card and paid an additional 3.99% so that the Wahlburgers did not have to cover that expense. I did. A third anecdote does not come from me directly, but from one of my friends who traveled recently. He mentioned that at the restaurant he went to, there was a menu item that you could buy before checking out called Beers for the Kitchen. And this is where you could add several dollars as a tip that would go to the cooks and the dishwashers behind the scenes. I thought this was very interesting, and I don't know if I would call it beers for the kitchen, but I think it is really a good idea that those that are working behind the scenes, or as they say, the back of the house, also can get additional tips or gratuities or compensation for the work that they do. All right, well, to wrap up today's show, there are many, many scenarios when tipping is appropriate, and there are many, many scenarios when tipping is not appropriate. Many of the scenarios where tipping is not appropriate is when the service is being provided, but the person who's asking you to pay the bill hasn't done anything to earn or receive a gratuity. Maybe it's at the cash out register for your dry cleaner. Maybe it's at the cash out register for fast food dining, whether take in or take out. Maybe it's returning a book to the library. There are so many examples where it's just now in this day and age, just please tip, please tip. Please feel free to add a gratuity. Again, I'm not recommending or discouraging anyone from tipping. I do just want to share that you should absolutely do your research, understand why you're tipping, if you're going to tip, and what is the services that you received. It is okay not to tip. Don't feel uncomfortable not tipping. However, if it is one of the services I mentioned in today's episode, please consider tipping, because this is the primary way that many of these workers earn their compensation. Okay, so just to keep it fair, I'll give 5 people that you really shouldn't tip. And these are probably common sense, but just to keep the podcast as even as we can, we'll mention a few. So you don't need to tip teachers. You don't need to tip medical professionals, i.e. nurses, doctors, or therapists. You don't need to tip your package delivery people. But I'll add an asterisk that if you have the same delivery person over and over and over, and you have a lot of deliveries, maybe you should give them a tip once in a while. Additionally, camp counselors and sports coaches don't need a tip, nor do your own employees of maybe your company or your coworkers. You can certainly thank all of these people with letters, with notes, with nice gifts, but certainly no tip is necessary. Well, if you enjoyed the content of today's show, please remember to subscribe, give us a like, give us a follow, because as we always say, together, everyone achieves more. And as the great Muhammad Ali famously said, we can only be truly generous when we expect nothing in return. So as it comes to tipping, please keep that in mind when you decide to tip or not to tip. That is the question. With that, I hope you live your best life, be radically generous. A great big booyah to ya. And this is another episode of the What Do We Do podcast, but we're just getting started.
The opinions expressed in this program are for general information purposes only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual or any specific security. It's only intended to provide education about the financial industry. To determine which investments may be appropriate for you, consult your financial advisor prior to investing. Any past performance discussed during this program is no guarantee of future results. Any indices referenced for comparison are unmanaged and cannot be invested into directly. As always, please remember investing involves risks and possible loss of principal capital. Please seek advice from a licensed professional.